Dean Martin walked onto the Tonight Show stage on December 12, 1975, carrying what he always carried, a cigarette in one hand and a rocks glass filled with amber liquid in the other. He took a sip, stumbled slightly as he approached the couch, and when he sat down, he nearly missed his seat. Johnny Carson watched all of this with that knowing smile he reserved for moments when he couldn't quite tell if his guest was brilliantly acting or genuinely three sheets to the wind. The audience loved it. They always loved it. Dean Martin, the lovable drunk. Cool, smooth, effortlessly funny, and always just a little bit loaded. Except here's the thing. Nobody could ever quite figure out. Was Dean Martin really drunk? Or was this the greatest acting job in television history? The question haunted Hollywood for decades. Some people swore it was all an act. Dean's daughter, Dina, insisted her father rarely drank, that the whole persona was borrowed from comedian Joe E. Lewis, that Dean was a dedicated professional who wouldn't dream of going on television drunk. Other people who'd worked with Dean, partied with Dean, watched him night after night, weren't so sure. They'd seen him put away bottles of scotch and bourbon like they were water. They'd seen him functional at levels of intoxication that would hospitalize normal humans. They couldn't quite believe it was all fake. The truth, as it turned out, was somewhere in the middle. And the story of Dean Martin's drunk act, how it started, why it worked, and what was really in that glass, is one of the most fascinating mysteries in show business history. Dean Martin wasn't always drunk Dean. When he first got famous in the late 1940s, teaming up with Jerry Lewis, Dean was the straight man, handsome, charming, the singer who provided the romantic ballads, while Jerry did the manic physical comedy. They were one of the biggest acts in America, movies, television, sold-out shows in Vegas. Dean sang beautifully, acted competently, and kept Jerry from completely destroying the act with his unpredictable energy. Then in 1956, they split up. It was messy. Jerry wanted to do films without Dean. Dean wanted respect as a solo performer. The partnership that had made them both millionaires ended, and suddenly Dean Martin had to figure out who he was without Jerry Lewis. That's when he met Joe E. Lewis. Or rather, that's when Dean's handlers pointed out that Joe E. Lewis had been making millions for years with a drunk comic act. And maybe Dean should consider something similar. Joey Lewis was a legendary comedian and singer who'd survived having his throat slashed by the mob in the 1920s. His voice was permanently damaged, but he turned it into comedy gold, playing a lovable drunk who couldn't quite get the words out right, but was funny trying. Frank Sinatra had even played Joey Lewis in the 1957 movie The Joker is Wild. Dean watched that movie, studied it, saw how audiences responded to the drunk persona, the vulnerability, the looseness, the sense that anything could happen. It was the opposite of the controlled straight man character he played with Jerry Lewis. This was dangerous, unpredictable, fun. Dean decided to try it, and it worked immediately. Audiences ate it up. Dean Martin, the handsome Italian cuner, now playing a guy who couldn't quite hold his liquor, but somehow made it charming. He started doing it on stage in Vegas, then on television. By the time the Dean Martin show debuted on NBC in 1965, the drunk persona was fully formed. Dean would stumble out with a drink, slur a few words, make a joke about being loaded, and audiences would roar. But here's what made Dean's version different from Joey E. Lewis's version. Dean was also impossibly cool. He wasn't a sloppy drunk or a sad drunk. He was a fun drunk, the kind of guy you want at your party. He made drinking look sophisticated, glamorous, like something the Rat Pack would do between takes of Ocean's 11. He was drunk, but he was Dean Martin drunk, which meant he was still cooler than everyone else in the room. The problem, if you could call it a problem, was that nobody knew where the act ended and reality began. Was Dean really drinking scotch and bourbon on stage and on television? Or was it apple juice and iced tea carefully colored to look like alcohol? Dean never said, his friends never said, his producers never said. The mystery became part of the appeal. By 1975, when Dean walked onto Johnny Carson's Tonight Show that December night, the question had been debated for nearly 2 decades. Johnny had asked him about it before in that joking way Johnny had of asking real questions. Dean always deflected. "It's apple juice, Johnny. What do you think?" but the way he said it, you couldn't tell if he was being honest or playing along. That night in December 1975, Dean seemed particularly loose. He sat down on the couch, or tried to sit down, nearly missing it, and immediately launched into a story that made no sense. Something about a horse and a priest and a nightclub in Chicago. Johnny tried to follow along, but Dean kept losing the thread, starting over, laughing at his own confused narration. He'd gesture wildly with a cigarette, nearly dropping it. Then he'd take another sip from his glass and start the story again from a completely different point. Johnny was doing what Johnny did best, trying to make sense of chaos. Wait, Dean, was the horse in the nightclub, or was that a different story? Dean looked at him with those heavy-lit eyes and said, Johnny, I have no idea what you just asked me. The audience roared. It was either the most brilliant comedic timing in the world, or Dean genuinely had no idea where he was in the story. Ed McMahon, sitting at his announcer's desk, was laughing so hard his face was red. Doc Severson was shaking his head, grinning. This was why Dean Martin appearances were must-see television. You never knew what you were going to get. Planned chaos, actual chaos. The line was invisible. The audience was howling. This was Dean at his best, or worse, depending on how you looked at it. Bob Hope was the other guest that night, and even Hope, who'd seen everything in 60 years of show business, seemed mildly concerned. At one point, Hope leaned over and asked Dean, you okay, pal? Dean waved him off. I'm fine, Bob. Never better. Johnny, always a professional, kept the show moving. He asked Dean about his upcoming Christmas special, about his kids, about his golf game. Dean answered all the questions, but his words came out slightly slurred, his timing just a beat off. It was masterful if it was an act. It was concerning if it wasn't. Then Dean did something that added to the legend. He picked up his drink, that ever-present rocks glass, took a long sip, and set it down on Johnny's desk instead of the coffee table. Then he forgot it was there. When he reached for it later, he knocked it over. Liquid spilled across Johnny's notes and desk. Everyone froze for a second. It was this part of the bit. Was Dean really that drunk? Johnny, quick, as ever, grabbed some tissues and mopped up the spill, laughing. Dean, that's my monologue. You just drowned. Dean looked genuinely apologetic. Sorry, Johnny. I thought that was my desk. Backstage after the show, something interesting happened. Fred de Cordova, Johnny's longtime producer, watched Dean walk off stage. De Cordova had produced the George Goel show in the 1950s, worked with hundreds of performers over 4 decades. He knew drunk from acting, and he later told friends that as soon as Dean walked behind that curtain away from the cameras, he straightened up, the stumble was gone, the slur disappeared. Dean walked to his dressing room like a man who'd just finished a shift at the office. But then other crew members told different stories. They'd seen Dean in his dressing room, before shows, with a bottle of Jack Daniels. They'd smelled the alcohol on him. One camera operator swore that Dean's drink wasn't apple juice. He'd gotten close enough during tapings to see that the liquid in Dean's glass moved wrong. Too viscous for juice, too genuine for colored water. The truth, according to those who knew Dean best, was that it depended on the night. Early in his career, when he first started doing the drunk act in the mid-1950s, it was mostly performance. Dean would have a drink or two to loosen up, but he wasn't drunk. He was acting drunk, using timing and physicality to create the illusion. The drink in his hand was often apple juice or weak scotch, enough to sell the bit without actually impairing him. But as the years went on, the line blurred. Dean started drinking more in real life, not to the point of alcoholism. His friends insisted he never lost control, never let drinking interfere with his work, but enough that sometimes the drunk act wasn't entirely an act. Sometimes Dean would have a few real drinks before going on stage, and the looseness people saw wasn't performance. It was Dean Martin at 3 drinks in Dean Martin, which still made him funnier and cooler than most people sober. His daughter Diana later said something revealing. My father liked to drink, but he was never a drunk. There's a difference. He enjoyed bourbon and scotch. He'd have drinks with Sinatra with his friends, but he was always in control, always professional. The drunk thing was his character, not his life. But she also admitted there were nights when the character and the man overlapped, when Dad had had a few drinks and then went on stage and it was all real. And those were usually the best shows because Dad wasn't trying anymore. He was just being. That December night in 1975 on The Tonight Show was probably one of those overlapping nights. Dean had likely had a few real drinks before walking out. Not enough to be dangerously drunk, but enough to enhance the performance. Enough to make the stumble when he sat down genuine. Enough to make knocking over the drink an accident rather than a planned bit. Enough to make Bob Hope genuinely ask if he was okay. And that's what made Dean Martin's drunk act so brilliant. It existed in that space between truth and performance where audiences could never quite figure out what was real. Was he acting? Was he drunk? Was he both? The uncertainty made it fascinating, made people watch closer, made every Dean Martin appearance feel slightly dangerous, like anything could happen. The apple juice question became such a famous mystery that it overshadowed almost everything else about Dean's career. People forgot that he was a legitimately great singer with a voice that could make That's Amore sound both romantic and fun. They forgot that he was a good actor nominated for a Golden Globe. They forgot that he'd been part of the Rat Pack, one of the coolest groups of entertainers in history. Instead, everyone wanted to know what was in the glass. Was it really apple juice? Frank Sinatra supposedly once joked, Dean actually spills more alcohol than he drinks. But was Sinatra joking or telling the truth? Nobody knew. Johnny Carson knew, though. After 30 years of hosting The Tonight Show, after watching Dean Martin stumble onto his stage dozens of times, Johnny knew. But he never told anyone. When people asked, and they asked constantly, Johnny would smile that enigmatic smile and say, Dean Martin is one of the great entertainers of our time. That's all I'm going to say. In 1993, 2 years before Dean died, Johnny retired from The Tonight Show. In one of his final interviews, someone asked him one more time, was Dean Martin really drunk on your show? Johnny thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, Dean Martin was always exactly as drunk as he needed to be Dean Martin, which is the most professional thing I can say about anyone. It was the perfect non-answer, the perfect preservation of the mystery, because maybe that's what Dean Martin understood that nobody else did. The mystery was a point. The uncertainty was what made the act immortal. If everyone knew for certain it was apple juice, the magic would disappear. If everyone knew for certain it was real alcohol, the charm would be gone, replaced by concern. Instead, Dean Martin existed in that beautiful in-between space where entertainment becomes mythology, where a man with a drink and a cigarette and a crooked smile could make you laugh for 40 years and never quite let you know if he was putting you on. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. He was 78 years old. Among his possessions found in his home after his death were dozens of bottles of bourbon and scotch, some full, some empty, some half-finished. Also found several bottles of apple juice. The authorities cataloged everything, but they never said which bottles showed more use. They never revealed which shelf in Dean's bar got the most attention. Was it the top shelf where the expensive scotch lived, or was it the refrigerator where the apple juice waited? The inventory list existed somewhere in the Los Angeles County records, but nobody ever leaked it. Another secret Dean took to the grave because even in death, Dean Martin kept a secret. Was he really drunk? Was it all an act? The answer died with him. And maybe that's exactly how Dean wanted it. The lovable drunk who might not have been drunk at all, or might have been drunk the whole time, or might have been something between that only Dean Martin understood. All we know for certain is this. On December 12, 1975, Dean Martin walked on The Tonight Show with a drink in his hand, stumbled into his seat, knocked over his glass on Johnny's desk, and made America laugh. Whether that drink was bourbon or apple juice doesn't really matter. What matters is that for those 15 minutes, Dean Martin was the coolest guy in the world. Drunk or sober, acting or real, he was Dean Martin, and that was always enough. If this story of Hollywood's greatest mystery, the thin line between performance and reality, and the lovable drunk who kept everyone guessing for 40 years, entertained you, subscribe and share it with someone who appreciates the art of the con. Have you ever been unsure if someone was acting or being genuine? Share your story in the comments and hit that notification bell for more stories about the legends who made entertainment an art form.